Hello, Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Kamp, President and CEO of the Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce, here for our second funnel, March 18th weekly legislative update video. I wanted to start off by highlighting some key things as we look at the second legislative funnel to really touch on some key issues. One of the biggest things right now is items to trade is not as easily identifiable. Some of the big pieces have already kind of been settled on, like tax reform, and some of these budget targets. Those have already kind of been settled on. They're still working through some of those, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But there's a lot of different pieces that are kind of falling into place, and it's going to be kind of hard as we look at the rest of session sometimes to identify where some of these different pieces of legislation are going to fall. As an example of that, some of the governor's priorities that are still out there are perfect examples. When you look at things like school choice funding, the unemployment bill, tort reform with both trucker and medical malpractice, the workforce code-based bill for the engineers and practitioners. That's something that those are all in a tricky spot, as are the renewable fuels bill. The renewable fuels bill is also in a fairly tricky spot, finding a lane for that to pass here in the next month or so of the legislative session. One thing that's important to note, there was something that kind of doesn't happen very often that occurred yesterday, I believe it was, on the House floor, and they brought a bill to the floor where they had paired some anti-vaccination and requirements for employers and businesses and such with the trucker tort reform bill. And they brought it to the floor, and usually, obviously, if you bring something to the floor, you know that there's the votes, but there was some whipping of votes and by some folks, and that actually failed by 3 votes. So that's something that it's worth noting, because 1, it has to do with the trucker tort reform that we've talked about in the past, but 2, that's not something that you see happen sometime. So it just also speaks to what the position is for some of these bills, as I mentioned before, being in a tricky spot for something like that to happen. Medical malpractice, if you look at the tea leaves and figure out where that stands, provisions of pulling back the number of weeks and stuff like that, and the 1-week delay time. If they weren't even included in that bill with the trucker tort reform, you would be led to believe that they might have more than 3 votes needed to pass. So that's something that if those are going to pass, and those are things we've watched throughout session, we're going to have to see some significant trading around and compromise, and also some whipping of votes on that front to see something like those move forward. The last thing I wanted to touch on with the second legislative funnel is just to remember that all ways and means bills, appropriations bills, and leadership bills do remain alive after the second funnel. So that's something that is worth noting. So as they work through the budget targets, once again, that I'll touch on in a little bit, they're also going to be working on a lot of those bills, plus all those that passed obviously out of a respective committee in the opposite chamber after passage to make it through the second funnel. With regards to tax bills, I really wanted to focus on a few things. There was an editorial done by the former majority leader of the House, Chris Hagenow, now with Iowans for Tax Relief, and he touched on TIF and a project that's being done in Johnston. And we really we didn't publicly go out and do anything along those lines, but it is important to note for those of you who may know about this or have seen something about it. It's just important that the area that they're talking about is blighted. It's something that that has been noted by the local community, and the local community will know if you speak to them that it is a blighted area, which is what the purpose of TIF is. And while it is for kind of a retail project, commercial project, for kind of a Top Golf kind of concept spinoff, but there's a bigger picture there, because it also ties into the Des Moines Water Trails project in Johnston. So it's something that they're looking at, a blighted area, to make an improvement that ties into a larger community project, which, if you think about the use of TIF, that's a perfect use for TIF. So I think it's really important that we differentiate between the opinions that are being laid out there and kind of provide the backstory as well as to what that project is. And we do think, as we look at and work with our partners throughout the state, that project does make sense. And we do think that it's important to defend TIF when some people try to come at it with some perhaps misguided or misrepresentation of what is occurring there. One thing I also wanted to touch on is the business property tax credit that's included within the Iowa Department of Revenue bill. That was flagged by the League of Cities earlier this week. Professional Developers of Iowa also kind of flagged it and did some work on it as well. But they registered against it, the League of Cities and Professional Developers of Iowa, because of a specific section, section 11, I believe it is, that would kind of move that business property tax credit to an exemption. It's tough to do something like that and move to opposition late in the session, because it draws the ire, as you can imagine, of a lot of legislators. So it's something you have to be really careful in doing and be very strategic in doing, because that's something that can make it hard going forward for the rest of session. But the one thing that I did want to note is that the counties are supportive of the issue because it streamlines the process for them. Obviously, the League of Cities did raise a red flag on it. The Metro Coalition did not. Those are the 11 largest communities in the state of Iowa. So that's an important piece to note as well. One thing that is also important to note as we stand with our partners at the city is that it only transitions to the exemption if not paid for. So that's something that's also important to noting as a differentiation that needs to be made as well. With regards to port authorities, Representative Hine, the chair of that House Ways and Means Committee, it really sits in his lap right now to bring it up for a subcommittee and then to the full committee to move it out of the House. It passed last week, the 2nd actually of March, 48-0 in the Senate. We've done a lot of work on that. Senator Dawson was hugely impactful in helping it get moved through the Senate in such a unanimous fashion. And now we're over into the House side of things, where we have to get it through the Ways and Means Committee with Representative Hine. And that's proving a little bit difficult simply because of the Iowa Farm Bureau. Frankly, they haven't registered on the bill. They aren't even undecided, but yet they're still very much acting like an actor who would be opposed to the bill. And that's really something that needs to have light shone on it, because that's not how this should be done. If you're going to speak to a bill and you're going to provide facts on a bill and background on bills, and you're going to do all these different things and speak to the merits of a bill, you should be registered on it. That's why if you're going to speak on it at a subcommittee, you need to be registered on it. You don't go behind the scenes and not be registered on it and operate in that manner. And that's just not the way that it should be done. And all of our partners agree with that as well. That's not how we do business, and we don't think that's how business should be done. So we're hoping that we're able to have a good conversation with all people that are involved and work through some of those differences, because it really is a good piece of legislation, as shown by the fact that it passed unanimously 48-0 in the Senate. We are working closely with Brent Segrist. He's on the Ways and Means Committee and in the majority party, obviously. Charlie McConkey is in the minority party, but he's also on the House Ways and Means Committee. And then we did loop in Majority Leader Winchell as well up in Missouri Valley. And once redistricting occurs, he actually is going to be into part of Council Bluffs as well. And he's a very good contact and has been helpful, just as Brent and Charlie have been as well. But that's something, this is a very important piece of legislation as we look at the riverfront and what the future holds for joint development between the Greater Omaha and Council Bluffs MSA. And this is a bill that we're really kind of leading on and pushing on, because we stand to frankly gain the most in the state as the largest metropolitan area in the state of Iowa. So it is important to note what's going on with the bill. Also note kind of the tactics that are being employed by the Farm Bureau. That's not something that we think should be done. They have every right to voice concerns. That's perfectly fine. They just need to register on the bill if they want to do it. With regards to the budget update, they've been moving them out of the House, some of them out of the House this week. The biggest one, as you can imagine, with education, and largely that's been figured out with the SSA and the funding for schools and the transportation costs and other things. But the HHS budget is now kind of the biggest piece of the pie, and that's something that's always somewhat difficult to work through just because there's so many moving parts with it. So that's something we're seeing them work through, and we think there's a little bit of differentiation on where the House and the Senate stand on that. So we'll continue to watch where that goes in the next couple of weeks of the session. But with regards to looking at and kind of reading the tea leaves for the budget and the appropriations process, the way they're moving right now and how they've kind of streamlined things, as I mentioned earlier, they really could possibly be getting out before Easter. That would be before their per diem ends. That would be adjourning early. One of the things that's nice to be able to be done by the holiday. Not everyone celebrates Easter, obviously, but a lot of folks do. So that's something that a lot of them in this capital are looking at as kind of a backstop. But then also it's not only planting season for a lot of the farmers, but it also is something that a lot of them are going into, primaries, new districts, all these different things per the census and redistricting. So that's an important opportunity for them to be able to get out to some of the new areas within their districts, get to know their constituents, and really do some of that outreach. It also gives us an opportunity to kind of start talking about what's next session look like. Even though it's a new General Assembly, new bills will be brought up, there won't be carryover, things like that. That's something that's going to give us an opportunity to kind of prime the pump on some of our key issues as well. Another key thing that we're really watching closely with the Iowa Chamber Alliance, and that's the 16 largest chambers in the state of Iowa, is we're watching the Iowa caucuses. As you can imagine, that's something that's hugely impactful on the economic and tourism side to the state of Iowa as we look at coming up on 2024 and people already being here, especially on the Republican side, looking ahead to 2024 and more so getting ramped up as we move through the year and into next year. But the Republicans have pretty well secured the fact that they have no intention of getting rid of Iowa's first in the nation caucus status. It's the Democrat, the DNC, that we're really looking at having a potential conflict with, or not even necessarily a conflict, just a challenge, and educating them on why we feel like this should be remain the first in the nation. One thing that's important to note, Ross Wilburn, who's from my old stomping grounds up in Ames, he's the Iowa Democratic Party chair. There's been no formal proposal to the Democratic National Committee. He was in DC last week having these discussions to move from the Iowa caucuses, but Nevada, for example, is a state that's really putting forward a case right now to say, hey, we should be that. What's interesting is New Hampshire isn't necessarily pushing as hard as you, or if at all, of what you would think, because they're also worried that any impacts to Iowa could potentially have ripple effects on them as well. So they're kind of sitting back, which is kind of an interesting concept and a dynamic as well. So that's something that's very interesting and very much worth noting, because as we all know, the Iowa caucuses, as I said before, they have a huge tourism impact. They have a huge economic impact. So we have no interest as a state in losing them. So the chambers, I think it's important to note, the chambers are proactively looking at what can we do to be of assistance on the Democratic side in this case, because the Republicans, like I said, have already pretty well shored up that they plan on very much carrying through with the Iowa caucuses in 2024. But we have to really convince the DNC, and that's something we're committed to doing going forward. One thing to note, and the last thing I'll note regarding this, is that you do have to look at a little bit of the fact that the likelihood may be somewhat of a challenge, just simply due to the fact of all the different things that are going on the national scene and how those have impacted President Biden's approval ratings. Doing something along these lines may not be something that may be of interest potentially to someone in that particular scenario where they're seeing kind of declining poll numbers. That's just one piece of information to consider. Obviously, there's a lot of different pieces to consider, but that is one important one to consider with all the external factors that are at play with his approval rating going forward. I also just want to end, as I always do, by thanking you all for supporting the Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce and our public policy program. Obviously, we thank you for supporting all of our programming, but specifically in this case, the public policy program. The state legislative session is really a prime time for us to showcase what we are able to do and the impacts we can have, especially as a border community next to one of the largest states in the region, making us once again the largest metropolitan statistical area in the state. So we really do appreciate your support. It really does allow us to do what we need to do on the advocacy front, not only in this case at the state level, but also at the federal and local level as well. So thank you for your ongoing support. We look forward to continuing to work with you, and I hope you have a nice rest of the day.